This is part 2 of my Ursa Major and Ursa Minor unboxing and organizing. In this video, we're going to cut out our pattern pieces and start sewing. I really like this quilt because I think it's going to be a good one for beginners. There's a lot of large pieces and a lot of full blocks that aren't broken down into smaller sections. So I think it'll be really easy for a first timer. So let's get started. In the last video, I showed you how I like to organize my fabric using the cut guides that come in the kits. This is what mine looks like. I use the stickers that come on the fabric as little tabs, and then I make myself a little binder bound with elastic. So I've split my pattern pieces into 2 categories. The large blocks, the large pieces, and then the smaller pieces. And we're gonna work with the large blocks first and get those out of the way. That serves 2 purposes, remember. We make a lot of progress right at the start because some of these are full blocks, so we only have to piece 3 pieces of fabric and we're done with that block. And then secondly, it reduces the amount of fabric we have to deal with later when we're dealing with the smaller pieces and just makes the process easier. So once you have your pattern pieces split, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, some of these are easy to decide which pile they go in because it's the full block. So obviously we want to deal with that first. A couple of them might be eligible for either pile. Sometimes if it's just a full block or almost a full block and then just a little corner, I'll go ahead and put the little corner in the first grouping just so that these are done together and they're easy to assemble, and then there's a block done very quickly and easily. So it's really up to you if you want to do only full blocks first, or you can squeeze in a couple corners too. I do recommend starching your fabric before you start cutting. It just makes it easier to handle. And even though we're not so worried about shrinkage anymore with the modern fabric and the modern manufacturing, it does help to alleviate a little bit of the discrepancy that could happen later in the washing. So I like to pre-starch just before I start cutting, and that makes all of my fabric really nice to handle. This organizing process absolutely applies if you're just making one quilt. Just pretend like you just have one pattern piece instead of my 2. So once we get our fabric pieces divided, the first thing we're gonna do is file them according to their color. So these are numbered. We have 1, 2, and 3, and the spot in the first place, that's what I'm gonna use to file them. So in this case, we have NR Niagara, and I'm gonna put this piece in the book under Niagara. So I'm going to continue doing all of my pattern pieces from the main stack like this. I'm going to get them all filed first. If I've got a piece like this with some blank paper on it, I'll go ahead and trim this and then file it. Something to keep in mind while you're cutting out your pattern pieces, I do not cut precisely on the seam allowance at this point. I cut very loosely because we're going to sew these and then trim on the seam allowance. So I don't feel it's necessary to trim very precisely right now. For me, it's just a waste of time that I don't want to spend. Once all of your pieces from that first stack are filed, we're going to start cutting. And this is where it really gets exciting because you see how quick we can make some progress. And your book is a little big right now, but that's why we added extra in those elastic loops. So we're going to turn to the first page, which is BE Bluebell. I'm going to get my pens and a marker ready. And remember, I'm cutting out 2, so my fabric will just be folded. You will use a single layer of fabric, but I have 2 pattern pieces, 2 layers of fabric. Otherwise, it's the same process. I do like to cut off my selvages. As I mentioned before, I do not use the cut guides to make sure that I'm cutting according to the layout in the guide. I really just use them to make sure I'm cutting the correct color. So when I turn to that page and I find a pattern piece, I mark it off just to make sure that that pattern piece is in fact on that page. I am cutting the correct color. First piece here is BE, and I'm going to just put it in the corner here. And I will go ahead and pin it. And then I'm just going to cut very roughly. I am just not worried about being completely accurate at this point. We want to give ourselves a little bit of room to work with, and the fabric allotments are generous. So even if you cut roughly or make a mistake, you'll have plenty of fabric to work with. I'm going to set this aside for now and then pull the next pattern piece. Then this one, I'm just going to pull back the pattern and cut underneath it. Once all of that fabric is done, I'm going to put that fabric back in its place and then file these pieces according to number 2. So this one goes into QQ and S. And then I'm just going to turn to my next color and do the same thing. Next is BL Blue. I'm going to mark off my pattern pieces and then cut from this one. Now this one is ready to sew because pieces 1 and 2 are cut. So I'm going to take the piece number 2 and just stick it on that pin that's already in there. And if you really want to make it secure, you can stick that pin back down into the fabric, but this will not go anywhere. So that one gets added to the sewing pile. I like to use these pieces of cardboard. It's just a piece of scrap cardboard with some batting glued to the front of it. And this makes a nice surface to put your pieces on because it's not slick. They won't slide off or go anywhere. So I just have a bunch of these boards and I use them anytime I have blocks or pieces that are cut that need to stay put. Once I'm done cutting that fabric, I'm going to fold it back up, put it back in the book, and then file these pieces. Now this one, number 2, is BE Bluebell. We just dealt with that one. It's before BL in the book. So I'm not going to work backwards. I'm just going to file it, and then maybe by the end, I'll have others that I can cut at the same time. Once I go through the book the first time, I will go back to the beginning and do it one other time. This ensures that I'm cutting a lot of one fabric at one time. Instead of cutting individually and turning to a page and cutting one piece, I can get a lot done with less time. You could also put the fabric on top of the pattern, making sure your seam allowances are covered, and then just fold the fabric back to create a crease. And then just cut outside that crease. Once you have your pieces all cut, it's time to sew. I'm going to show you very quickly how to deal with some of the odd angles that you might encounter. It does not have to be stressful. I have a very easy method for that. This piece is a very good example. I've got my pieces cut roughly, but I want to make sure I get them lined up just right when I go to sew. So the first piece, number 1, I'm going to pin onto the pattern, and you could glue or tape if you prefer, but I'm just going to put a pin in there very quickly. And then number 2, I'm going to put over the spot number 2 and just fold back right on that seam allowance. I'm going to crease it quickly with my finger, and then on each end I'm going to crease at the end points. I like to choose the inside sewing line, not the outside seam allowance, but you could choose either one. So when I go to sew, I like to keep my lower number on the left and the next higher number on the right. I flip my pattern piece over, and then I just line up on that crease line, matching the top and bottom points with those creases I made. Whether or not you adopt any or all of my organizing and cutting methods, more than anything, I really just want you to be able to jump in and have fun. I wanted to show you how it doesn't have to be complicated, and these are actually very nice kits to work with. The great thing about the solid fabric is there's no right or wrong side. So that's also a really nice feature when you're just starting out. You don't have to worry about that aspect. You can just jump in and sew. If you want to see a part 3 to see how I continue cutting and sewing, be sure to comment and let me know. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.